Hello and welcome to Rock and Roll Politics, the lockdown special, this virtual show. We were meant to be live at King's Place tonight. For those of you who bought the tickets, know only too well, but we're not letting this virus stop us. We're going to do a virtual show which will feature, as far as we possibly can, all the elements of the normal or abnormal show. So what we're going to do is, if it's okay with you, we're going to, in the first half, I'm going to kind of set the scene by reflecting on a number of interesting themes, I think, surfacing from this extraordinary period that we are living through. The first one being Boris Johnson and leadership. The kind of, he's back, isn't he, today? And that in itself is interesting. Oh, he's back. Laura Coombs said, we might see him, as if he has risen Christ-like from the dead. And that's partly what I want to reflect on in a bit of this first half. The way perceptions of leaders can change by something happening to them. And those perceptions can be misleading. It can also change the way we view the immediate past as well. And so I'll be looking at that. By the way, it's very interesting with Johnson. His statement, we did see him. And I hope those who regard this as the return from the dead were excited. But what fascinated me about the statement outside number 10 today is the degree to which people choose to see or hear with Johnson what they want to hear. So many people say negatively or positively that he is an optimist, and that frames his messaging. And so it was either dismissed or hailed, this statement, as optimistic outside number 10. I didn't see it like that at all. It's clear if you listen or read it carefully, along with the 5 tests that the government has set about when to lift the lockdown and what to do next, they are being very, very cautious. I think those 5 tests have been unfairly dismissed as vague. If you read them, it's absolutely clear. Their priority, or listen to Johnson this morning outside number 10 when he had risen from the dead, it's absolutely clear that his priority is to avoid a second wave of this ghastly virus. And when that becomes the priority, you are cautious. Now, words can change with Boris Johnson. He can say things and subsequently forget he ever said them. But if he means it, I think they're going to be really, really cautious about the way they move from this lockdown, because they do not want a second wave. And that has profound implications for all of us. Anyway, we're going to look at leadership. Then we're going to look at these daily press conferences in number 10, those ones with the ministers and officials, that curious relationship between the two, Whitty and Jenny and Rob and all of that. They are both dull and compelling, eerie and yet significant. And I think they have changed just by the very manner of their existence, changed the dynamic of this whole period, at least from a British perspective. So the press conferences. Then we're going to look at delivery. This is in a way the biggest theme of the lot. This is a government formed largely around the Brexit campaign. They are campaigners. Delivery is very different. And they are struggling with the structures they themselves set up in the coalition era, reforms to the NHS conducted in that coalition era. And we're going to have a brief look at that. And then we're going to look at video politics, the video, those MPs speaking from their offices or bedrooms or whatever, and how that is working, their bookshelves neatly choreographed. I've done the same. These books are the ones I've read during the lockdown, believe that. And by the way, I did the Sky newspaper review the other day, and apparently I was kind of arguing for the lockdown, if anything, saying, look, I think it should be tougher, and apparently the only books on the bookshelves behind were of Hitler. And I got loads of tweets afterwards saying he's a Nazi, he's got all these Hitler books. Ever since, I've carefully arranged them to avoid any Hitler book being in sight. But I can see myself now, and I can see Ian Kershaw's Hitler on the side there. I just can't get rid of them. And maybe I'll have to burn them, which is, of course, the option that Hitler used. Finally, we'll look at Keir Starmer, the early days in his period as leader of the opposition. Always a crucial time for a new leader of the opposition. That early phase, much is decided and defined in that period. We'll look briefly at that. Then we'll take a short break, get a glass of wine or a beer, and then we'll have the Q&A, your questions arising from what you put in this first half. So that's kind of what we're doing. We can't do our live predictions, but those who come to the shows in Edinburgh or London or elsewhere know that we usually have a bit of fun with our predictions at the beginning of each show. If we were live with an audience, I would have asked in front of me, I would have asked when you think the lockdown will end and what will follow. Maybe next time we'll work out the technology to get these predictions, but don't worry because, as some of you know, they are always wrong. Now, before all of that, a couple of important announcements. I usually improvise announcements and improvise everything else actually, but these are so important I've written them down. So first of all, just the technical thing of how you ask questions. There's a chat section at the side of the YouTube screen, and so that's where you can put the questions in, unless of course you're watching the stream with the full screen, then you won't see them. But if you've got part of the screen available to you, you'll see an option for questions. If that becomes technically problematic, just tweet me, Steve Richards 14, and I'll find them that way. I've got my assistant here at safe social distance collating the questions, and some of them will get through in the second half. And then this is the most important announcement of the lot. As you know, the venues and performers are having the worst year probably in history, the history of live performance, all of them closed. So if you enjoy this show, or actually if you hate it or are completely indifferent to this virtual show, please consider donating to King's Place. There's a donate link in the description to this video, or head to the supporters page on the King's Place website, and please make a donation, because we want these places open as soon as possible when we can all gather to them again. And they are kind of dependent on ticket revenue, constant stream of people. They can't do it at the moment, so donation would be fantastic. Now, leadership and Boris Johnson. What fascinated me so much when he went into hospital, Johnson, was the way the narrative turned, and turned the way he was perceived as a leader. As he fell ill, he became heroic. And it was a mistaken perception, but a potent one. Now, partly, of course, that was down to sympathy. People understandably were worried for him and about him. And not to have been would have been signs that you were a psychopath. So that's part of the explanation, but that's the least interesting bit. When he went into hospital, especially when he went into intensive care, the question was asked immediately, how do we cope as a government and as a country? The Prime Minister is out of the picture. How the hell are we going to get through this? The implication being, he was the heroic Titan without which we could not cope. Now, part of the implication arises from an unquestionable fact that in the midst of an emergency on this scale, the Prime Minister is unavoidably and inevitably the central figure. You need a central force coordinating, deciding on a near hourly level. And when that figure disappears to intensive care, there is a vacuum. One filled with a degree of restraint, I thought, by Dominic Raab. We'll come on to him in a minute. So that is unquestionably true. But in posing the question, how do we cope from here? I think immediately, in the cases of some, the immediate past changed. Because Boris Johnson, before he went into hospital, when he was well, was not, I think even his greatest admirers would admit, this heroic Titan that he became when he fell ill. He was contradictory. unwise in some of his public statements. So early on, if you remember, he was showing off that he shook hands when he went to a hospital. He shook hands at a packed rugby match. He clearly wasn't observing social distance with consequences that we now know. And his optimism, which I was reflecting on earlier, I don't think he is being optimistic at the moment, by the way. I think, as I say, he is incredibly cautious about the impact this disease is continuing to have. But before he went into hospital, he said things like, yeah, we're 12 weeks, that's what we'll take over, we'll be ahead of it, we'll get this virus in 12 weeks. What did it mean? What, that it was going to be gone by some miracle in 12 weeks? He was unclear. Then the lockdown was late, and we know from that Sunday Times report, and indeed others, that early on he didn't attend those Cobra meetings. Number 10 have downplayed this, saying prime ministers often don't attend them. That's not true. And in a similar situation, I am sure that a Theresa May, a Gordon Brown, a Tony Blair would have rushed from wherever they were to attend those Cobra meetings, and Johnson was in Westminster. So at the very least, his record before he was rushed to hospital was erratic. And yet in hospital, it became titanic, as if the past can change because someone falls ill. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? I was interested as well because often when a prime minister falls ill, there is a fear that it's over for them, and it can often be over. Both Macmillan and Eden fell ill and resigned soon afterwards, partly citing illness. It was ironic, actually, in both cases. They lived for decades afterwards. But they did not transcend illness and become heroic. They left office. When Churchill had a stroke, they suppressed it because his image of being this titanic war leader would have been undermined. And indeed, when Churchill had pneumonia during the war, it was downplayed. So it was so interesting that Johnson became heroic. And one of the reasons he did was to do with these daily press conferences, these events that are dull and compelling, eerie and yet significant, virtually meaningless and yet meaningful. Because the press conference that followed Johnson's hospitalisation was all about the implications. What are you going to do? There was Dominic Raab in place, standing in for Johnson. And the very existence of these daily press conferences mean two things. One, each day, the government feels obliged to make some kind of announcement to show that they're on top of this bloody thing, because if they just stand there and announce statistics about the numbers dying and so on, it will look as if the virus is getting them. At the same time, journalists too need new lines each day as they sit there in their homes or isolated in an office. And so inevitably, the questions in Johnson's absence was who is in control? One of the questions to Raab, absurdly, when he was this temporary figure on his first day in temporary charge was, Mr. Raab, would you press the button to generate a nuclear apocalypse? Something along those lines. The test being, is this guy fully in charge? Raab, to his credit, didn't answer it, although I saw a flicker of excitement at the prospect, I think, of having such power. But each question implied a kind of, again, heroic absence, fueled also by newspapers who, in falling ill, portrayed Johnson, as they did Thatcher during the Falklands War, as epic figures. One front page, I think, said, in effect, he risked his life to save yours. It was like the, as I say, the reporting of Margaret Thatcher during the war. And these reports do change the way a leader is perceived and to some extent how they perceive themselves. I remember after the Falklands War, Margaret Thatcher started referring to Winston Churchill as Winston, as if she knew him well, which she didn't, by the way. But I think she felt she had become Churchillian. Johnson famously idolizes Churchill and wants to be Churchill-like. And some of the reporting turned him into more of a Churchill figure, in spite of the reality being far more wobbly in advance. And again, it's interesting, when I was mentioning Macmillan and Eden, when other leaders even dare to acknowledge weakness and fragility, it changes the way they're perceived, normally in a negative light. I remember when Harold Wilson resigned as Prime Minister in 1976, a lot of people kind of speculated he might be ill. I don't think he was, actually. But in his farewell interviews, he looked and sounded knackered. He said things like, well, one of the reasons I've resigned is that the same old problems keep on recurring. And when you face them a number of times, you don't want to face them again. And you can see what he meant. Poor sod, been around for a long time, inflation raging yet again, strikes yet again. Oh, bloody hell. But in saying it in that way, he conveyed a weariness that defined him for decades. He became ghostly and seen as a weak figure, partly because he conveyed at the end a weary fragility. But in his fragility, Johnson has become heroic. We will see how long that lasts and the degree to which the past has changed as a result of that perception, and how long that perception of the past stays in place. But it's there at the moment. And incidentally, if you listen to Johnson's statement outside Number 10 today, repeated regularly in full as if it was kind of, a theological announcement from a godlike figure, it's very clear what the government's defence is going to be in a public inquiry. Johnson repeated at least once that their objective was to make sure that the NHS could cope, that there would not be an issue with capacity. And he said that the rest of the world is wondering how we did. And of course, the rest of the world is not actually in awe of Britain's performance in this. And he didn't mention PPE, he didn't mention other issues that are ongoing, but that will be the defence. Curiously, a lot of people said after his statement it meant nothing, but actually it's all there. The next year or so, you can kind of map out his thinking from that particular statement. It's worth kind of reading it, and then you'll know we're going to come out of this very slowly, and that will be his defence when the public inquiry is held in about 2060. Those daily press conferences often don't reveal very much. One of the great twists of this drama is the seriousness and gravity of the epic events that we're living through wholly justify daily press conferences. Trump was doing them until he completely screwed up the other day by telling us we should all inject detergent, or was it detergent? I think it was, as a possible cure. I think he's now stopped doing them, sadly, because it was one of the great bits of light entertainment to look forward to each night. But the daily press conferences, while justified broadly because of the scale of the emergency, are also absurd because, like in any grave situation, actually there aren't huge epic events every day that change the whole choreography, but they have to give the impression that there are. So each day the government agonises over what announcement to make, and then, as I say, the journalists want to get stories as well to justify leading with this thing every day. And it kind of does change the choreography. The Number 10 spent hours trying to sort out a line for the press conference. Sometimes the scientists blow it. I think the day when Chris Whitty said that nothing will be found in terms of a vaccine in this, I think he said the next calendar year, which meant we're going to be stuck into this situation until about 2030 or something. Well, I don't think that was intentional as a news line, but it became huge. And I could see Raab or whoever was with him twitching a bit nervously because they can tell, you know, what's going to take off as a story. Sometimes the officials behave extraordinarily, actually. We are so used to treating non-politicians with reverence and respect that some of the statements from these medical geniuses have been unquestioned. I remember Jenny standing, I think, next to Raab and saying that, do you remember when the WHO guy said, test, test, test? And Jenny said, that doesn't apply to us. You know, it applied to some countries, but not us. Anyway, she said the other day, a classic political answer. So I have been asked about that several times. And what I said then was taken completely out of context. And then she said the WHO guy was taken out of context. Well, if you see what she said, and he said it wasn't. So they are being highly political, these officials, as well as trying to project information as calmly and soundly as they can, and sometimes surreal, you know, when you see those bloody charts of the death rates going up, and Britain, it seems, quite often in line with Italy. But the good news is it's plateauing today, and if we stay home, it should fall, you know, and all the rest of it. Anyway, they try and do that calmly, but it's so interesting, that relationship between the two. And I remember when Jenny said that the way we had responded was a model that other countries are looking at, a bit like Johnson today. I could even see Dominic Raab twitching a little awkwardly at such an assertion. But they suck up a lot of time and energy in government, these daily press conferences. And the journalists now are very conscious that they are being slagged off for asking gotcha questions or not asking gotcha questions. The reality is that it's a really limited format. Politics needs room to breathe to get anywhere. And a journalist asking one question, or even, they went through a phase, they've stopped, they went through a phase, Laura, would you like a follow-up question? And there would be another question, and then that would be it. And then on to someone else from their bedroom. It's very, very difficult to elicit anything in that format. You need time to probe and explore these kind of deep, deep issues, and the press conference just doesn't allow it, never has done. It's a very, very limited format indeed. One of the things that the government has done to try and get a new line each day is make all kinds of announcements, tests, PPE equipment. Matthew Hancock, who I think has worked around the clock and is passionately sincere, and will be one of those, rightly in my view, arguing for a very, very cautious end to the lockdown, because that killer virus is still out there. But, you know, 100,000 this, 8 billion PPE kits coming over tomorrow, flying in from here, there, and then you hear on the ground that there aren't any PPE kits or whatever. And the gap between the press conference announcement needed to be made each day, because the bloody press conference is being held. What are we going to say today? What are we going to say today? But the gap has been huge. And for reasons which I think in some ways shine more light on the way Britain is run than anything else that has happened in this drama. Because this government, formed on the back of that Brexit campaign, knows how to make a slogan, knows how to make a pronouncement that can excite. And they do that, as I say, on a daily basis at this press conference. And I hope that the announcement will resonate if Whitty or one of the others doesn't kind of ruin it. And then delivery is something altogether different. And you suddenly become aware, or they do, of the number of agencies involved these days in delivery. The fashion in that coalition era, and actually before that in parts of the new Labour era, was fragmentation. That somehow by fragmenting the NHS and other public services, you could introduce a bit of competition, you could introduce all kinds of other ways, and just keep government out of it. That was certainly the aim of the Cameron era. I remember when Cameron was leader of the opposition being invited to seminars called the post-bureaucratic age, where people like the then Shadow Health Secretary Andrew Lansley would say, my aim is when there's a health crisis, the Today programme doesn't ask the health secretary to come on, but they ask the particular hospital or the patient to come on, because we're going to change everything. And in bringing about that cultural change, which didn't happen, of course, they created Public Health England, all kinds of agencies without quite realising what they were doing. So, for example, Cameron, in the winter before he was planning to call an election, said to the then Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, Jeremy, could you please just tell the hospitals to get ready for this health crisis so we avoid it? Don't just tell them, instruct them. Jeremy Hunt had to say, Prime Minister, we've given away the power to do all of that to NHS England and others. He said, well, get the bloody power back. And Cameron was self-deprecating enough to admit this, that he couldn't really bear the consequences of his own reforms. Boris Johnson probably didn't even know the detail of those reforms. He's never been a great one for detail. And I'm told from the Department of Health that Number 10 have said at times, what is this bloody Public Health England and NHS England, and why aren't we in charge? And, you know, and that issue, which has been a huge issue but underreported, of the fracturing of responsibilities. Who's in charge? The Health Secretary, the Treasury, Number 10, NHS England, this huge quango, Public Health England, the NHS trusts, often competing against each other. I was doing some talks in one of the Yorkshire regions, health regions, and they showed me a flow chart of who was responsible for what and the overlapping responsibilities. This was years ago. And it kind of was a maze. And that is one of the issues that needs addressing when we're through all of this. Just got to check the time. God, blimey, must be wanting a glass of wine. I'm going to finish quite soon. Yeah, the fracturing of public services in very different forms. Look at the railways. When anything goes wrong, whose fault was it? Was it Network Rail? Was it the Transport Secretary? Was it the train operating companies? So many agencies supposedly responsible, therefore no one takes responsibility. One thing that will also change, if that does change, I think it will, that fracturing of public services will be looked at. One thing that might change is that we're all going to use Zoom and video more often, not for live events. I promise you this, when we're allowed back in theatres, we'll be back in theatres. But it was very interesting. At first in politics, it was a struggle. I watched the health committee meeting the other day via Zoom. Jeremy Hunt, the chair, was there in his neat little study. I think he had put a suit on for the occasion. And Matt Hancock was in his room with slightly weird paintings behind him. And then he went to somebody, a Labour MP from the north of England, who said, I just want to say, what the hell is happening with this pig? And then she froze for about 2 minutes. And Jeremy, oh dear, I don't think we got the essence of what you were trying to say. Would you mind having another go? This absolute disgrace of, froze for another kind of minute. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. So it went really badly, but PMQs went okay, much better than I thought it would go. I thought it would be like that. Instead, videos froze as if they could hear the person. So it froze during a question from Peter Bone. But other than that, it went really, really smoothly. And PMQs, of course, was the first big moment on the public stage for Keir Starmer as Labour leader. He was against Raab. And the general consensus amongst the commentariat on Twitter and elsewhere was very positive. And this is significant for 2 reasons. One is it confirms to me an instinct I had that Starmer's early phase would make an impact, in spite of the fact that he is beginning his career as leader of the opposition in the worst of possible circumstances. You know, when you begin in the context of a national emergency, the entire focus as far as people focus on politics, is on what the government's going to do to try and get us out of it. And as a powerless leader of the opposition, only with words to utter, it's not a great way of leaping onto the centre of the national stage. But this is a crisis that cries out for questioning of depth and also guile. All leaders of the opposition must display guile. And Starmer is well suited for this in a way that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't. Jeremy Corbyn had never thought in advance of becoming leader. Well, he hadn't really thought about leadership at all. He hadn't wanted to be a leader, and suddenly there he was at Prime Minister's questions, having to try and think on his feet, which he couldn't do. And Starmer, a lawyer, can do it. There is an argument, actually, that barristers or lawyers are certainly well equipped for Prime Minister's questions in a way that most other vocations do not prepare people for. But the point is, Starmer did well, and people noticed the difference. A government being held to account through a figure who could respond to answers if they were evasive and woolly, and also a leader who had a clear structure to the 6 questions he was asking and a sense of purpose behind them. And on Twitter, people said, oh, wow, this is great. You know, right-wing commentators, George Osborne and others, praised Starmer. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because views about a leader of the opposition are formed very quickly, often unfairly, and then never change. And so if you have a bad beginning, you are doomed. And when people, you might be thinking, oh, you're already talking about the reaction of political journalists. But let's be honest, most people don't follow politics in the raw. They don't watch the House of Commons. They have politics mediated in the end through the media. And political journalists giving him the thumbs up is important in the same way as them giving him the thumbs down would have been disastrous for him. Take William Hague. William Hague became Tory leader in 1997. And because New Labour was so fashionable then, Blair walking in water, the commentariat decided very quickly that Hague was a disaster. So, for example, Hague went to the Notting Hill Carnival that summer when he became a leader, and he wore a baseball cap. Some of you will have seen the photo of him. Now, actually, if you look at the photo now, because Hague is quite popular, you'll say, oh, he looked all right, he looked quite cool, you know, he's slim, he works out, he had a baseball cap on, he was at Notting Hill, that's all right. But at the time, it was dismissed as absurd and a sign that he was not fit to be a leader, because the commentariat had decided he wasn't. So you see things that you want to see, not necessarily what is in front of your eyes. And so when Hague gave a statement after Princess Diana's death that same summer, it was the same. He actually gave a rather sober response. I can't remember, but it's a very sad moment for the country. Thank you. But it wasn't on the Tony Blair. She was the people's princess, and we miss her. And it was actually measured and probably more proportionate in a way than the people's princess. But it was dismissed as wholly misjudged, not capturing the mood of the nation. And in a way, from that moment, Hague was doomed. He never, ever got to a point where people said, yeah, he could be leader, until he stopped being leader. And then ironically, people are much nicer to politicians when they stop being politicians. I remember hearing a 5 Live phone-in when Hague was on after he had left, and somebody phoned up and said, William, can't I just say, William, I think you'd make a brilliant leader of the Conservative Party. You're definitely the one who could win an election. And William said, well, I have been leader of the party, but thank you very much. So he became an ex-leader who could be a future leader, although he never wanted it. All ambition was sated after that trauma. Starmer has not had that Hague-like experience. I could give other examples, but we're running out of time. but he has had a good start, and that means he will be perceived, for the time being anyway, through a more flattering prism. If he went to the Notting Hill Carnival, if it was allowed to take place this summer, and wore a baseball cap, I was going to say he'd get away with that, but I don't know whether he would actually. I can't quite see Keir Starmer in a baseball cap at the Notting Hill Carnival, but you know what I mean. We see what we want to see. So there we are. There are a few thoughts. What's the time? Yeah, blimey, we've been going for nearly 40 minutes. Thank you for your patience in these rather bizarre circumstances. I hope you've asked lots of questions. I'm going to collate a few of them now. And we could talk about lots of things. We can talk about the nature of our lives over the next year. Clearly, there are going to be easings of the lockdown, perhaps as early as May the 7th onwards, although I suspect it will be very incremental. Maybe some of you would disagree. Whatever, the impact of Johnson's return on many different levels, the press conferences, who's really running things in this country, a deep question, even with this crisis. Anything, but do ask. We're going to take a short break now, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes for some questions and some answers. Thank you for listening. See you very, very shortly for the second half of the lockdown virtual special. Thank you. Welcome back to Rock and Roll Politics, the virtual show. I'm sitting down now. I wouldn't normally be sitting down, but I want to read the questions. We've had loads of questions. So kind of in the second half, we will be having almost the discussion we would have in the shows live in a theatre. So we've got so many questions. If it's okay with you, I'm going to start right away, beginning with those on the YouTube website. Noah K asks, when the government say they're following the science, are they simply passing responsibility onto science or the experts to avoid accountability for difficult questions? That is a good question and a complicated one, because when they say they are following the science itself is not some sort of objective script where a group of geniuses, Witty, Jenny, Valence, you know who I mean, all say the same thing. The genius from Imperial College all say, Mr. Johnson, here is the science and you must follow it. They get different kind of viewpoints. I think genuinely at times they consult the science in inverted commas. I think, and you can tell this already from some of the briefings, that in terms of that early phase where clearly the UK fell well behind the curve, I think they are up for blaming the science when the moment comes, that public inquiry in 2060. But there is some attempt constantly to hear from science, judge from science. And I do think in terms of the lockdown, the science will have a big part to play in terms of the risk of a big lift too quickly, the degree to which the infection rate could rage. This thing they're always going on about, if it gets above 1, what they mean is if it infects more than one person who gets it, affects one, it's got to be well below that. So I think they are half following the science, but this is a ruthless political operation. And if they need to blame the science, which can mean many different things, they will. Brilliant question. Judy Billing, hi Judy, says, is it okay that I was reminded within seconds this morning how absolutely ghastly Boris Johnson is? It's an absolute disgrace to feel like that. You should be arrested. No, he returned and the reactions were fascinating. As I say, some were so excited just to see him. I read tweets from columnists saying, oh, he looks so relaxed and well. I thought, God, I must get this virus to look so good. And others didn't. As I say, it's worth dissecting his statement because I read it as one of great caution about the route ahead. Others saw it as buoyant and optimistic. It's weird how he generates wholly different responses. But no, you needn't feel bad about your reaction. There are so many here, I've got to rush through them. From Richard Reiser, I think, sorry, it's on a very small screen here. Do you think the herd immunity theory links to Dominic Cummings' eugenics view? And does this link to not providing proper support in terms of PPE and other matters? The role of Cummings is fascinating. He is an influence, and the degree to which the scientists told him what he wanted to hear, we don't know. And we will find out, I guess, in the end in this public inquiry. But it seems, as far as we can tell, because he is not a figure who is accountable publicly, that Cummings had a change of mind from being a great advocate of herd immunity to being one of the advocates of a very, very tough lockdown indeed. And I'm told, but we don't know, as I say, because he's not accountable, that he is one of the cautious ones, having got this bloody virus, about lifting it too quickly and speedily. But that whole herd immunity thing, almost unique to the United Kingdom, as other countries were saying, what the hell is the UK doing? The reasons for it are still very blurred. And because there is a denial that there was a change of policy at any point, we still don't quite know. But Cummings' role, he's a big player and is a big influence on Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson doesn't instinctively admire many people. But I'm told when Cummings comes into his room, he sort of lights up in the same way that when, with Tony Blair, when Peter Mandelson walked into, Peter, a bit like that with Cummings and Boris Johnson. Now, what a great name for the next question, Mr. Fabulous. My question, will Britain find itself inevitably getting closer to the US as the government moves away from the EU? It's very interesting that Johnson, while recovering in Chequers, phoned President Trump almost immediately because he knows he needs that trade deal with the United States. If Britain is pulling out of a deal with the European Union, perhaps with no deal by the end of December. So the answer for the time being is yes. What is really interesting is if Trump loses that presidential election in November and Biden comes in. Remember, Biden worked very closely with Obama. Obama said if Britain left the European Union, it would be at the back of the queue for a trade deal. Now, that's not Trump's view, but he might lose. What happens then? Thank you. Can I be called Mr. Fabulous? It's a great name. Rushing through these, sorry. Venetia Kane, will the government ask for an extension? This is to the Brexit trade talks. Did Raab and co just follow the party line, or did they mean it when they said, that there's no way an extension can happen? This is so interesting. All I can do on this is report what you hear. And whoever you speak to from the Treasury in number 10, Michael Gove, who I don't know whether he was in his house or in his office, was the guest of the Brexit Select Committee today, chaired by Hilary Benn. They are unequivocal that these trade negotiations will end in December, to coin a phrase, come what may. And they say there's enough time. And this is hugely significant because we are running out of time. Johnson, if he wants an extension, needs it in July. And there would have to be legislation to get an extension because they've legislated not to have one. So time is running out. At the moment, all you hear is that they will leave in December. From Terry Smith, do you think we will ever be told the true number of deaths, or will it be suppressed, like so many inconvenient truths? I think we will know the true number of deaths because in the end, although they're slow to do it, because we get the hospital deaths each day, the total number are it's a very gruesome thing, but are easily quantifiable. And I think we will get the total. And so I find it slightly surreal. You see each day those charts, and the UK thing is quite close to Italy, But I hear the geniuses say we're plateauing and coming down. But I think we will get the total number. From Tony McNulty. Hello, Tony. Was at least part of the overwhelming sympathy with Johnson the thought that Raab was waiting in the wings? It is interesting, the worry that was part of that extraordinary 24 hours when Johnson went into intensive care. And by the way, I believe that the cabinet and number 10 thought he might not come through. I don't think that was a sort of act. But part of it, as Tony suggests, was absolutely a fear of Raab. And yet Raab, when it came to it, and this in itself became problematic, was quite self-effacing. He didn't take any controversial decisions, but that in itself sort of left a vacuum where no one was quite sure what was going to happen next. He really did play the role of a sort of self-effacing stand-in, but he is not a popular figure in that cabinet. They were worried that he would take over and become some kind of megalomaniac. He wasn't a megalomaniac, even when he was asked to press the nuclear button by a journalist in a sort of fantasy scenario. But yeah, I think there was, a fear of what might happen under him. And quite a lot of the sort of neuroses surrounding this government is about the individuals. So, for example, when The Guardian reported Cummings attended SAGE meetings, the fact is that it was Cummings doing it was the cause of worry, rather than the fact that a government advisor was a sort of attending. It's the personalities of this government that alarm some. Joe Ruffles, Steve, how lucky was the government that Johnson fell ill? Wishing Boris well became the new wearing of a poppy. How much did this help the government skate past criticism? So I think that's a brilliant question. That relates back to what I was saying earlier, that in a way the illness, although no one wants to fall ill in this nightmare, I think did help the government, because it generated those headlines. He risked his life to save yours, and it gave a kind of sense of urgency that the government itself wasn't displaying until he fell ill. So the illness, which no one would wish on anyone, and he got it badly, I think in a curious way helps him and helps the government, and has now given him, I think, a sense of urgency, because although we got a lot of waffle about how well the government was doing outside Number 10, said I kind of detected caution about risking any move that generated a second wave of this nightmarish virus. Kim, I think it's Kim Scudamore. Oh, thank you. To remind us of the Edinburgh that we'll be missing this year, could give my Harold Wilson impression? Well, I did actually, you must have, very briefly, I gave my Harold Wilson. Do I do it every year in Edinburgh? That's pathetic and rather sad. I'm not one of these, but I'll do impersonations. But I did do Harold Wilson a bit in the first half. Stephen Clark, hi, Stephen. When do you think planning for coronavirus became more of an urgent priority for Johnson than Brexit? Now, this is a key question, because there's no doubt in January, as this virus took hold, including in the UK, the focus of Johnson was on January the 31st and that Brexit happening. His focus was on trivial matters like whether Big Ben would bong and all other matters related to Brexit. And at that point, I think the evidence suggests he didn't turn to the virus. I think he did finally turn when that genius from Imperial College persuaded him that the NHS was about to be overwhelmed, and has clearly turned to it now, having been a victim of this nightmarish disease. But it was late. That Sunday Times story has been rubbished by Number 10, but the essence has been uncontested, not turning up to Cobra meetings and so on. And I think the reasons for that are many: his own personality, the other issues on his mind at the time, one of which was Brexit. So it was only when there was this real sense that the NHS could be overwhelmed that he turned to it. Robert Reed, a key player in King's Place. Hi, Robert. What do you think will be the impact of the virus crisis on the timetable for Brexit negotiations with the EU? Will it force delay? Well, this has been it's very interesting. A lot of questions about this. Robert, all I can do is report what we're hearing at the moment is that the government is determined that there will be no delay. But it reminds me a bit, you know, when the speculation that a currency will be devalued and there's no hint of devaluation until it happens. And maybe there will be a moment when an announcement is made of delay. We'll know in the next few weeks, but at the moment, they are determined to go through with it, even though businesses, the farming sector and others are really, really worried about the implications of no deal. We're back to no deal, which used to dominate these shows in times before the virus struck. A few more questions. Leon, sorry, I've got, I'm reading this on tiny, I think it's Leon LeBlanc, French. I don't know whether you are French, you know. As with the prorogation of Parliament, BJ used that as an opportunity to escape scrutiny and drive a coach and horses through our constitution. Will the opposition allow him to do that again? Well, this brings us on to Keir Starmer. With a lot of questions, I did go down the questions during the break. A lot of questions about scrutiny, Keir Starmer, and all the rest of it. And the answer is in two halves. The first half is this. He still has a huge overall majority. That December election remains a key moment in this drama. I didn't even mention it while I was talking in the first half. But while he has a majority of 80, frankly, he can do more or less what he wants, even with this virus rampaging around this country and elsewhere. But at the same time, and this is the second half, the answer, and answers a few other questions. Keir Starmer is a more formidable scrutineer, challenger of government assertions. And I think that will make a very big difference very quickly. You saw it, as I mentioned, in the first half last Wednesday, Prime Minister's questions. Probably you'll see it again this Wednesday, and in other fields as well. So the potency of Starmer is part of this whole set of ingredients. He can't magic away the arithmetic in the House of Commons, which is really, really tough for Labour. They can't change anything. Jeremy Corbyn could. He was leader in a hung parliament. He could defeat the government, and he did many, many times. Johnson hardly won a vote. But that majority is a huge buttress for Johnson, whatever the forensic scrutinising of Starmer. Time for a couple of other. Rachel Martin asked about the difference Starmer makes in terms of accountability. I say he makes a big difference in terms of the nature of his probing and questioning, but he faces that Commons majority. But he will make, he is part of the new scene, but so is that Commons majority of 80. We've got, God blimey, tons and tons of questions. I better just, given that I asked people to tweet questions as well, do forgive me, I'm going to look on Twitter. Hold on a second. Somebody asked a very nice question, which I did check earlier, which, hold on, where is it? Will this be recorded for the website? Because they want to show it to their family. And the answer is, I did check this, yes, it will be there available. So if you want to watch it all again, it's going to be there. If you want to show it to others, it's going to be there as well. John Slinger. Hi, John. Do you think that events, dear boy, events that we've experienced since February, March, mean that even with, this is interesting, with the 80-seat majority, this government won't go the whole 5 years? That 80-seat majority is a kind of buttress to die for. And I think this government, in some form or other, will keep going, because you just do not give up an 80-seat majority. But you're right to raise the question. There are certain circumstances where parts of this current government could implode. It is quite vulnerable, given that nobody knows quite what's going to happen next with this virus. It could emerge triumphant in the period that follows, but on the basis of its form up until now, I think triumph is an unlikely destination, and there will be moments of real fragility, as there was for Thatcher, both in the House of Commons after she won in 83, that landslide. By 1985, she thought she might have to fall over the Westland helicopter affair, something that none of you will remember. And of course, Thatcher fell after her triumphant third win after 1987. She was gone by 1990, when everyone was writing she was invincible. So Johnson could fall, and I don't think that is inconceivable for a moment, but it's very hard to imagine this whole government giving up an 80 majority. It's why elections are so important. You've got to win them, and then you have power forever. From Mark Williams, picking up what you were saying last time at King's Place, we all, by the way, gathered at King's Place in February. This bloody virus didn't come up friend of mine was going to Japan, and he asked afterwards, should I go to Japan? And everyone said, oh, no, stay here, it'll be safer. Now look where we are. Anyway, at King's Place last time, here's the question. Oh, yeah, the importance of the leader of the opposition, shadow chancellor pairing. Good question, Mark. What do you think of Keir Starmer's choice of shadow chancellor? This is, because it's not to do with the virus, it's quite a nice place for us to end. Yeah, it's really interesting. Every successful leader of the opposition has had a close and productive relationship with his or her shadow chancellor. Not many leaders of the opposition become prime minister. It's a tough, brutal role to play. Those who did had really good relationships with their shadow chancellors. Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe, although in that Shakespearean arc, Howe brought her down. In opposition, they were really close. Thatcher used to sort of utter slogans, get this, my father never spent more than he earned in his Grantham shop, and the state can't spend more than he earned. But it was Geoffrey Howe who was doing the hard work behind the scenes, and for a time they danced together. Blair and Brown, famously close, and like Howe and Thatcher, not close by the end. And indeed, it's quite a parallel. Brown, in the end, brought Blair down, but worked brilliantly in opposition and thought similarly. And Cameron and Osborne were also close, and Cameron ended up as Prime Minister. So the appointment of Shadow Chancellor is key. And I think Keir Starmer, in appointing his Shadow Chancellor, Annalisa Dodd, has made a sensible choice that they are not as close as those previous examples that I gave, and they do not have that sort of binding drive that Blair and Brown had in opposition, and the others did actually. But they think along similar lines and will work well together. So it meets two of the criteria. I think some of the others who we could have considered were economically at least as credible, if not more so, but they might not have worked as well together. So it is really important to have that kind of basis of a trusting rapport with your Shadow Chancellor. It's much the most important appointment of the lot, and I think he's done well with her. Now, we've got time for one more. From Fionola O'Connor. Sorry, forgive me, I can't read the small print on this thing I'm reading. How have Rishi Sunak's prospects changed? Well, we could have done an entire evening about Rishi Sunak, this figure who a year ago was a junior minister, then became chief secretary and is now chancellor, spending hundreds of millions of pounds. And he is the one who I think is widely considered to be having the best war. Johnson, as say, became heroic by falling ill, but he became semi-heroic by spending money on a big level. But that for Rishi Sunak will be the easy bit. He's got the art of tonal empathy. I'm told that the first time he appeared at one of these weird press conferences, the Downing Street press conferences, it was the first time he had ever been at a national press conference. And he's got that Blair-like capacity for tonal variety and conveying empathy that none of the others, who are rather wooden performers, can do, including actually Boris Johnson, who is regarded as this great communicator, but actually isn't. Sunak has flourished, but he has had the easy task of spending a lot of money. There will come a time soon when he has to work out ways of paying for all of this, and he will be then a much more contentious figure. But he looks cool. He's one of those who could pull off wearing a baseball cap. And by the way, somebody very kindly has sent in a thing saying Hague wasn't at the Notting Hill Carnival, he was somewhere else with his cap on. Well, Sunak could get away with putting a baseball cap on in a way that very few can. But it's early on. questions are being asked about elements of his economic packages. So let's see how he develops as a public figure. But he's having a good campaign so far. By the way, I'm told that he and the Treasury, they're all kind of very much sound money people. Tell you who should follow on Twitter, Nick McPherson, the former permanent secretary of the Treasury, to get an idea of the Treasury culture. It's very sound money is the way forward. And of course, this is the opposite of sound money. Let's spend another 100 billion on something or other. I always remember Alistair Darling telling me, he was Chancellor during the 2008 financial crisis. And before the crisis, because Gordon Brown was so determined to convey his prudence as a Prime Minister, if Alistair Darling wanted to spend 25 pence, there would be intense agonising between him and Gordon about whether they should spend that 25 pence. And then in this financial crisis, they were deciding whether to spend £300 billion or £450 billion. Suddenly, everything is on another scale. And Sunak, a sound money, economic, liberal, small state by instinct, is doing all of this. I mean, it's all so weird. But he is, as yet, I think, is not fully tested as a big public figure. By the way, someone else has asked about Nicola Sturgeon and whether her pronouncements are more kind of showbiz than substance. I think what you can say with Sturgeon is that even if actually she's not saying anything hugely different from the government in London, and most of the time she isn't, she is the most confident of communicators. She has become a communicator. As somebody said of Margaret Thatcher, power has made her beautiful. She knows how to convey a sense of urgency. And this is a real art of leadership. Give the impression of candor, even if you're not being that candid. And it is true that the document she published on the exit strategy isn't actually greatly different from the government back in London. It's quite evasive, but it gave the impression, as she says herself, we're going to treat you all like grown-ups. We're going to be honest about our thinking. And she's very smart and very authoritative in this crisis. And I think some of the people back in London at that number 10 daily press conference, that weird but compelling event, have something to learn from her in terms at least of that capacity to appear mature and authoritative and candid when sometimes you're not being candid at all. I think we better go, actually, after all that. I'm sorry if I didn't get through all the questions. Loads and loads are still coming in. I'll get through some of them and reply in different forms in the coming day or so. Before I go again, I've just got to do a reminder of that very important thing for King's Place, because, you know, it's not getting any ticket revenue. It doesn't get anything from the government. So if you enjoyed the show, if you loathed it, if you viewed it with total indifference and wondered what a man sitting on his own in his room is doing talking to himself, could you please consider donating to King's Place? There's a donate link in the description to this video, or head to the Support Us page on the King's Place website and make a donation. Because I said at the very beginning of this, we want these venues to open up when we can all gather again. Until then, in our case, I'm going to be here and you're going to be where you are. But we're going to get through this and carry on doing rock and roll politics virtually. Thanks so much. Brilliant questions. We might get some predictions in next time. Let's see. Thank you for listening, watching, taking part. I'll answer the questions one way or another that I haven't answered. And see you next time, either at a venue, or if we're still doing this, here in this office. I've got to rearrange these bookshelves and get rid of all those Hitler books. Thank you very much. See you next time. Have a great evening. Bye.